This is The Writing Game. I'm Gregory Palaci. Every story, regardless of medium, has a structure to it, or something resembling structure. Most of the time, it's intentional. Sometimes, it's an unintentional fluke. Other times, it's the result of utter disregard by all parties involved, whether it works or doesn't. Begin at the beginning, the king said gravely, and go on till you come to the end. Then stop. Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Games have structures just as stories do, and oftentimes those are the same structures. The original Halo Combat Evolved has a very literary structure, which is the reason I wanted to make this episode. But what good would I be at storytelling if I went and spoiled everything right at the start? On this episode, we're going to explore 4 narrative structures and how they can work with games. This isn't going to be an examination of the hero's journey and Dan Harmon's story circle, or the 3-act structure versus 5-act. There are plenty of great videos already out there that do just that. And I'll provide links to some of them, but rest assured I will do an episode about each of those and their relevance to video games in the future. For now, I want to talk about more narrative structures that work with or on top of linear or fractured narratives, as well as the hero's journey. It won't only be narrative that's affected by such structures, but character, point of view, level design, and more. Because of the nature of this discussion, not all of my examples will come from video games, but I'll do my best to demonstrate my examples in both video games and another medium. Probably books, because we are talking about narrative structures and many, if not all, have been piloted in the novel. And just so we're all on the same page, a linear narrative is the most common structure we encounter in stories. It's A leads to B and on to C and finally D. Most movies and games work in this manner. A fractured narrative is everything taking place out of order. Think Pulp Fiction, or any game that lets you select the order in which you accomplish missions. Granted, the second example isn't perfect as missions can come in any order, but the story can still be linear. Regardless, you should have a good idea of what I mean. So now, on with the fun stuff. Our first structure is the frame story, also known as a story within a story, which is not a new structure. It's occurred in many cultures and dates back thousands of years, because humans are nothing if not good about talking about themselves when trying to talk about others. 1001 Nights, The Canterbury Tales, Wuthering Heights, and Heart of Darkness are all examples of frame stories, where the narrator of the story within a story is taking part in a story of their own. Gears of War Judgment is probably the best example of this in video games, because it's not used intermittently, but as a structure that informs gameplay. It's a mechanic all its own. Judgment is also a frame story that closes out and completes both plots. Neither need be finished for a story to be told or a game to be satisfying. Yet, lack of closure of either story is a great way to leave room for a sequel, or to leave any resolution up to a player's imagination. But, and here's a line anyone who's watched my previous videos should be ready for. More on that in a future episode. Frame stories are great for all the possibilities they present. Episodic productions are perfectly situated for such a structure. Just think of How I Met Your Mother. The entire series, not just episode to episode, involved a frame story. Tales from the Borderlands all takes place within a frame story. The characters of Fiona and Reese are at the mercy of a stranger to whom they must relate their tale. In doing so, the structure allows for something few other games do: unreliable narration. Unreliable narration is a nice trick to play narratively in video games, because it always leaves the player questioning what's the truth? Is what the narrator or narrator's saying true? Or is it the gameplay experience of the player? You may want to say at this point that it's the gameplay, as that's what the player knows to be true, given that's what they've experienced. However, that doesn't have to be the case. Spec Ops: The Line did just this. It asked the player to question their actions and what they were seeing on screen even as they were continuing to play. Loading screen text, changes to the menu screen, everything began to play into this fractured narrative, this unreliable narration. This worked so well because the game mimicked reality in the lack of information provided. A black and white screen displaying the heat signatures of supposed hostiles marks no differences between combatants and civilians, so the player is forced to contend with this lack of information from the tools provided, not just the stories characters within the game are telling. Frame stories also allow for a change of perspective, telling the story from a different character's point of view. Doing so doesn't require a framed story. Halo 2 doesn't have one, and with each level you switch between the Master Chief and the Arbiter. But it provides a context within the overall narrative for the switch in perspective. This can play up the aforementioned unreliable narration as characters present opposing opinions of what happened. Unreliable narration and opposing views on events may not be what you actually want for your game, given the way fandom has developed to want a solid canon. Fictional universes, regardless of medium, can provide that solid structure, whereas reality doesn't. Just look at any conflict and the opposing side's views of how it occurred and why. Hell, Finland's participation in World War II is a great example. Finland fought 3 separate wars due to alliances and the resulting conflicts as those alliances changed. Those wars, by the way, were the Winter War, the Continuation War, and the Lapland War. It's an interesting aspect of Finnish history and one I encourage you to read about, because it will show you how, fighting on the side of the Nazis, people weren't necessarily in support of the Nazis, but they were against the Soviet Union. But they wanted to support the Allies, but couldn't because, the Soviet Union was one of the Allies. So it helps illustrate the trickiness of, international politics, for one. History and video games are replete with letters. It's not uncommon to find books that are a collection of letters between 2 famous people from history. In video games, those letters are often just a means of providing exposition and world building for the player, but those letters can have narrative. Our second structure is the epistolary novel, which may not be a common form now, but 2 of the most famous books to influence video games were written using this form: Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and Dracula by Bram Stoker. Documents, be they audio logs, letters, newspaper clippings, or other mediums, are rife within video games. But as mentioned before, they're more commonly used for world building. That doesn't mean they can't be used to tell the story of the game. What Remains of Edith Finch is an epistolary game. The entire story is being told as a letter from the player character, or narrator, to their unborn child. But it's also a frame story to tell the tales of the Finch family in their various comings and goings. The beauty of the epistolary is in its narration. It allows a narrator to speak to the player without directly addressing them or the player's actions. In the case of What Remains of Edith Finch, the narration is coming from the player character and providing context for all that's occurring within the game. It also allows for a more natural way of speaking on the narrator's part, as they are explicitly telling a story and not having a conversation. The epistolary novel, by and large, sticks to a single point of view, but it doesn't have to. If the novel, or game in this case, is about the relationship between 2 parties, then it makes sense for the narration to switch between them, and even have levels or characters change depending on who is narrating. Differing points of view mean conflict, not in a boom boom, bang bang, stabby stabby sort of war games they tend towards. Rather, conflict in terms of opposing ideologies, philosophies, strategies, or personalities. As with the frame story, an epistolary game allows for the exploration of the perspective. It allows a game to take a side in a conflict and explore it. Games, given their youth relative to other mediums, aren't always great at exploring a perspective. We see this time and time again in AAA games that set up a world that appears to have conflicting parties, or at least one with an atrocious message. But the game ends up not demonstrating how horrible those characters are and their philosophy is. Instead, the game ends up equivocating and placing the player in a neutral position with no stake in resolving the conflict for one side or another. The neutral position a player is often placed in does little to explore the message of the antagonist, nor place them in light that the player can feel true revulsion for. Instead, the player is tasked with returning the game world to the status quo, rather than bringing about change. The lack of change and return to the way things were before does nothing to resolve the issues which brought about the rise in the antagonist in the first place. Think of it this way. If Wakanda had been operating out in the world, sharing its technology, working to better the world rather than being isolationist, would Eric Killmonger have had a reason to return to Wakanda? Would he and his father, who would presumably still be alive, be allowed to come and go as they please, and not have to fight their way into the country? Epistolary games can explore the world the antagonists are creating and its impacts on others. By getting personal, by sharing the effects, and not merely creating a player-sized whole, the story told within a game can be one about consequences and change. It can explore the message and can eliminate equivocation. Our third structure, and the one I'm most excited to explore, is the chiastic structure, or chiastic. Depends how you pronounce it. This is not to be confused with mirroring, which we'll explore in a future episode. The chiastic structure is sometimes also called a ring structure, but for now, we'll set that aside. So, let's look at Halo Combat Evolved and how its story and level design provided a great example of this structure. Halo begins with the Master Chief escaping a spaceship and ends with him escaping the very same spaceship. In between those two levels, he and the rest of the crew must descend to the alien artifact known as Halo and continue into its bowels to find a way to survive and fight off the Covenant. It's in the bottom of this hell they'll find an even greater evil, the Flood, whom they must escape and climb back out and away from Halo, ending, as mentioned, in the escape from the very same spaceship the game began on. Halo's level design illustrates chiastic structure almost perfectly. Some may consider it boring to backtrack and go through the same or similar environments, but in doing so, the game is demonstrating the depths to which the protagonist, Master Chief, was plunged in his ordeal and what he must do to overcome them. Chiastic structure, if I wasn't clear enough, is about repeating elements of the story in a mirrored fashion. It can be locations, actions, events, themes, or any combination of them that is repeated. And the most common example used is the simple idea of A, B, B, A. No, not the Swedish pop band ABBA, but the concept that there are two ideas, A and B. A occurs first in the story, followed by B. Then B is repeated, and the story ends with A. Of course, it can be far longer and more complex than that example. It can be A, B, X, Y, X, B, A, or any combination you want. And that's why Halo Combat Evolved makes such a great example. It's not merely the physical descent and return of the Master Chief, but the way the level design plays this out as well. Levels gradually get darker until the player is in the swamp where you first encounter the Flood. The Master Chief returns to the light and ascends to the heavens once more. Now, I may be waxing lyrical about Halo. It is one of my favorite games, yet there is a degree of thought that went into the construction of the game which is often overlooked. And that's how the design of the game can be used to emphasize or mimic the journey the player character is on. Ascents or descents through the play space do more than mirror the character's mission thematically. They provide a mental map of where the player is in the story. Bennett Foddy's Getting Over It is a great example of this. The mission of the player and the journey of the character are so succinctly mapped to the physical realities of the task at hand that were the game to be about descending, then the relief at accomplishing it would never come given the ease at which one can do that in the game. Halo and other games that utilize the chiastic structure recognize that the tasks placed before the protagonist and player are not ones that are going to slacken upon reaching a certain point. Rather, the return will be harder, the burden greater, for all the weight that has been placed upon the shoulders of the protagonist. In Halo, that's the knowledge the Flood's release brings a pending doom to the galaxy at large. The game switches from being about personal survival to being about the greater good. And all of that is placed upon the cybernetically enhanced shoulders of Master Chief and his AI companion, Cortana. What makes this form so appealing for the heroic struggle faced by the Master Chief, aside from the inherent power fantasy the game provides, is the fact that we, in the West, have largely been exposed to this structure throughout our lives. The chiastic structure is common throughout holy texts such as the Hebrew Bible, the Quran, Book of Mormon. It's also found in Beowulf and Paradise Lost. It's also why the ending of Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, is so long. Each storyline and element is being returned to and tied up. But where Halo was a descent followed by an ascent, Lord of the Rings is about the ascent of Mount Doom and then the descent and return to the Shire. The chiastic structure, like the aforementioned frame story and epistolary story, does not need to work in isolation. It can readily work with these other structures, such that it could be argued that any frame story makes use of the chiastic structure given it starts with one setting, A, and switches to the internal story, B, and ends with the original setting, A. The same is true for epistolary stories, as they allow for the repetitive or mirroring nature of the chiastic structure to also be used. Letters back and forth between two characters are ideal, depending upon your story and game, for such a structure, as the first and final letter can be what prompts and then summarizes the events of the story. They don't even have to come from the player character either. A final name for the chiastic structure is the ring structure, and in some ways this very much mimics the hero's journey. But we'll get more into the hero's journey and Dan Harmon's story circle in a future episode. As mentioned, there are plenty of videos about that very topic. We'll just look at how they apply to games. So, the fourth and final structure of this episode is the ring structure, not to be confused with the chiastic structure. As mentioned, we won't spend much time on this given it's worthy of its own episode. But it should be noted that whereas the chiastic structure requires a certain amount of repetition or mirroring of subjects, themes, locations, ideas, or plots, the ring structure does not. A character can go on this journey and return to the world changed, and that change can mean they're in a different place. Unable to return to their original location? Maybe. But their situation has been resolved, their problem overcome. From a game design perspective, the ring structure doesn't require a return to previous levels. merely a resetting of the status quo, which so rarely enables a sequel or another level. It's part of why this structure is so appealing. It's simple in its nature. Problem occurs, changing status quo. Player tackles problem. Status quo returns. This works for alien invasions, zombie infestations, war simulations, and plenty of other conflict-defined narratives in video games. And it should come as no surprise then that, as with the previous three structures, frame stories, epistolary stories, and chiastic structures, the ring structure can work with any and all of its counterparts as long as the status quo is returned to. And with that, we return to the status quo. All of us writing and not just procrastinating by watching this show. Thanks for taking part in this episode of The Writing Game. I'm Gregory Palaci. Everything I do can be found at onegamedad.com, and I can be reached there or on Twitter at onegamedad. If you want to talk writing, games, the show, or even working together, be sure to hit me up. The Writing Game is hosted by Third Culture Kids, which can be found at thirdculturekids.net, where the full transcript of this episode is available. Please be sure to like and subscribe or rate and review this show on whatever platform you find it. I'll see you on the next episode.